Welcome everyone to my online course for research methods in psychology. My name is Frank Losciavo and I will be your tour guide today. I have lots of interesting things to discuss, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. It's time for us to begin a new chapter of our course, and in this chapter, we'll discuss sources of information. We'll essentially ask the question, how do you know what you know? In other words, where did your information come from? These are important questions because not all sources of information are equal. Not all sources of information are equally valid. Not all sources of information are equally reliable. And some sources of information are likely to be biased. What makes this conversation particularly interesting is that much of the bias I just mentioned, it comes from you and your own personal experiences. That's right, much of the information you think you know comes from a biased source, and one source of bias is you. In this video, I will discuss two problems you'll run into when relying solely on your own personal experiences to understand human thought and behavior. One problem is that your personal experience has no comparison group, and that makes it difficult to understand how your life would be if you lived it differently. We'll also discuss how your personal experiences are confounded. That essentially means that your personal experiences are confusing. They contain a lot of drama. So it's tough to know which factors in your life influence various outcomes in your life. The good news is that scientific methods allow us to cut through unnecessary drama. As I've mentioned before, scientific methods help us find the truth. And for that reason, you'll see that scientific research provides a better source of information than relying solely on your own personal experiences. All right, let's get to work. I mentioned that relying solely on your own personal experiences for accurate, unbiased information is problematic because your life has no comparison group. Let's talk about that potential problem first. Here's the deal. When you rely on your own personal experience to gain information about human thought and behavior, you're only able to observe one human being at a time, and that human being would be you. That's a sample size of one. And of course, we can't learn much about human beings from studying just one person, because one person would be an insufficient sample size overall. And just wait, it gets worse, because you can't really learn all that much about yourself just by examining your own personal experiences. For example, like many people, let's assume you sometimes experience depression. And let's further assume that you see a physician. And based on the physician's advice, you start a new medication. After several weeks on this new medication, you're feeling good, you're reasonably happy. And based on your personal experience with this medication, you conclude that it works great, it's effective, it helped cure your depression. But here's the problem with that conclusion. Because that conclusion was based solely on your own personal experience, you weren't able to test other treatment options. In other words, you're just one person, and you can't clone yourself and then test yourself in exactly the same way, in exactly the same situation, using a different treatment option. So you'd be unable to ask yourself some key questions. For example, to determine the effectiveness of the new medication you're taking, it might be helpful to compare your current level of depression with how you'd be feeling if you never took the new medication at all. Let's look at one possibility. It's possible that without the new medication, that you'd still feel depressed, considerably less happy. But another possibility is that without the new medication, you might feel about the same as you feel right now, which is pretty good. And, of course, it's at least theoretically possible that without this new medication, without any medication at all, you'd actually feel even better. My point is that it's tough to make sense of how well that new medication is working because you don't have anything to compare your current situation with. That said, based on your personal experience, you think this new medication is great. Okay, but how would you feel if you were using a different medication? Maybe you'd be feeling even better. Do you see my point? It's tough to make sense of how well that new medication is working because you don't have anything to compare your current situation with. After all, it's possible that other medications work better than the new medication you're taking. So, in other words, you couldn't answer these key questions based on your personal experiences alone. Based on your personal experiences alone, you'd have no comparison data to help you make sense of that new drug. But here's some good news. We could answer these and other critical questions about the effectiveness of this new drug by designing a research study that tests a variety of people who are exposed to various treatment options. In other words, via systematic research, we could generate data that compares various treatment options so that we can determine which treatments are more effective than others. It's pretty tough to find answers like that based solely on your own personal experience. If I've confused you, the textbook does a great job describing the power of a comparison group using a different example, one that's based on research of treatments for breast cancer. If you can understand my prior example and this example from the textbook, then you probably have a good understanding of how important comparison groups are for making sense of research data, for making sense of the world around us. The bottom line is that by comparing groups via systematic research studies, we'll learn more about human thought and behavior than we would have ever learned from our personal experiences alone. Remember what I've said previously, scientists seek the truth. And when we're seeking the truth, it helps for everything to be as straightforward as possible. But in case you haven't noticed, there's nothing straightforward about human thought and behavior. It's very complicated, it's messy, it's confusing, and that's what I want to focus on next. That your life, your personal experiences, they represent a complicated mix of various events. So, for example, when we want to determine if that new drug you're taking really boosts your mood, that complicated mix of life events can leave us confused about whether the drug is responsible for your better mood or possibly something else. Let's discuss a realistic example. First, let's assume you've been taking a new drug for a few months and you're feeling really good. Compared to how you felt before, things are really looking up. As we try to make sense of your improved situation, it's reasonable for us to believe the new drug is responsible for your better mood. But we can't forget that your life, like everyone's life, is complicated. And we all understand that life has its ups and its downs. So let's assume that over the past few months, you met a nice girl or a nice guy, and you've been enjoying spending time together. Isn't it possible that this new relationship is responsible for lifting you out of your depression, and that your mood would have improved with no medication at all? Of course it's possible. So what I'm saying is that we can't rule out the possibility that your mood would have improved without any medication. Do you see what just happened? Your life got confusing. Now we're not sure if your newfound happiness is due to the drug or due to your new relationship. In these situations, careful researchers take notice. Careful researchers will see that something else, something beyond the drug you've been taking, has changed in your life. In addition to taking this new drug, you also started a new relationship. This means that your new medication is confounded with your new relationship. A confound is simply a confusion. So, in other words, the potential effects of your medication have become confused with or confounded with the potential effects of your new relationship. Because these two factors are confounded, because they are both new additions in your life, it's very difficult for us to know exactly why your mood has improved. Is it because of the new drug? Is it because of your new girlfriend or boyfriend? We don't know because we are unable to disentangle the potential effects of those two competing factors. So the key point is that in the real world, there are usually several possible explanations for an outcome. And we call these competing explanations confounds. One way to think about it is that real life is confounded. It's true, life is messy. And that, my friends, is another reason why you can't rely solely on your own personal life experiences when trying to better understand human thought and behavior. Because real life is full of confounds, and because life doesn't come pre-packaged with any type of control group, we need to look beyond our personal lives when we study other people. We need methods for simplifying the world so that we can isolate and test one factor at a time. If we can create situations where we can isolate and test individual variables, then we can learn much more about the effects of individual factors. The good news is that scientific research provides us with methods for isolating and testing individual variables. It allows us to study people in a more controlled environment, which is good. Next, I'll walk through a quick example to help you better understand that scientific research is particularly well suited for studying human thought and behavior. Have you ever gotten so angry or so frustrated that you just screamed or threw something across the room or punched a wall? Those aren't necessarily the best methods of dealing with our emotions, but they provide us with a way of venting our anger and our frustration. Is it beneficial to vent our anger that way? By venting our anger, are we less likely to take our anger out on someone else? Venting our anger by punching something, for example, is often called catharsis. And via personal experience, a lot of people think that venting anger is indeed cathartic, that it allows us to release our anger. And as a result, we're less likely to be aggressive toward those who caused our anger and our frustration in the first place. But is there evidence that catharsis actually leads us to be less aggressive? Well, Brad Bushman is a social psychologist, and he designed a well-controlled research study to test the catharsis hypothesis. Because real life is messy and it doesn't provide us with a good control group, he examined catharsis in a laboratory experiment that involved hundreds of undergraduate students. The students in the study wrote essays, and as part of the study, a guy named Steve criticized the essays and made other rude comments. Steve was a Confederate, which means he was essentially an actor working with the experimenter, but the research participants didn't know that. It was relatively realistic, and Steve's nasty behavior made the research participants angry with him. Most probably wanted to punch him in the face. Here's where things got interesting. Some of the participants had a chance to vent their anger based on one of three groups they were assigned to. In one group, participants were able to punch a punching bag for 2 minutes, and they were encouraged to imagine Steve's face on it. So if catharsis works, this aggressiveness would allow the participants to vent their anger towards Steve. A second group was instructed to punch a bag just as a way to get some exercise, and a third group was asked to just sit quietly for 2 minutes. Then the participants were given a chance to get back at Steve because they were asked to play a quiz game with him. And during that game, they had an opportunity to blast him with loud noise. So the question is, which group was most aggressive towards Steve? If the catharsis hypothesis has any credibility, the group who imagined punching Steve's face would be the least aggressive. And the group who sat silently would be most aggressive because they were never given an opportunity to vent their anger. Contrary to what the catharsis hypothesis would predict, participants who imagined punching Steve actually gave him the loudest blasts overall. Participants who sat quietly, those who never had a chance to vent their anger, actually showed the least aggressiveness towards Steve. Unlike the messiness associated with our own personal lives, do you see how neat and tidy this research study was designed to be? During this research study, Steve treated every research participant equally nasty. And each participant was given the same opportunity to retaliate against Steve, to get him back by blasting him with noise. And all along, the researchers were able to separate the effects of catharsis on later aggression. Other researchers have found similar results. Generally speaking, when people physically express anger toward a person, they tend to become more angry with that person, not less. In other words, researchers have found that expressing anger and aggression can lead to more anger and aggression. So, even though our personal experiences may lead us to think that catharsis may be effective, research results tell us otherwise. That doesn't mean that catharsis always leads to more aggressive behavior. Most research results aren't that rigid. Most research results aren't that straightforward. Instead, most research results are more probabilistic. That simply means that catharsis is more likely to lead to aggression, at least when compared with people who never engaged in cathartic behaviors in the first place. Although that muddies the waters a bit, I think most of us are used to this type of reasoning. For example, we know that smoking leads to cancer, but smoking doesn't always lead to cancer, right? Smokers are simply more likely to be diagnosed with cancer. In other words, smokers have a higher probability of being sick with cancer. All right, everybody, that's it for this section, but stay tuned because I'll have more to say about research methods in the next video.